President Trump took office, federal collective bargaining legal authorities were weaponized to sabotage what Americans had voted for. On their way out the door, lame duck Biden administration officials signed collective bargaining agreements with federal employee union bosses specifically designed to tie the hands of the incoming President Trump. In January, at our very first hearing this Congress, the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform heard testimony from President Biden's Social Security Commissioner, Martin O'Malley. He cut a deal with union bosses after the November election, after the election, and just before leaving the agency to run for chair of the Democrat National Committee. The deal locked in telework levels for tens of thousands of Social Security Administration employees for the entirety of the income.
So you want me to sit here and listen to James Comer, this Kentucky congressman who's made a whole political career out of performative rage theater, tell me that federal workers exercising their legal collective bargaining rights represents some kind of constitutional crisis, some kind of sabotage of democracy itself, and I'm supposed to just accept that framing like it's remotely grounded in anything resembling good faith analysis. Because what we're witnessing right here in this viral moment is nothing less than the Republican Party's latest chapter in a decades-long war against organized labor, dressed up in the respectable clothes of constitutional principle. And let me tell you something that should terrify every single person who gives a damn about the balance of power in this country, because even before President Trump took office, federal collective bargaining legal authorities were weaponized to sabotage what Americans had voted for, as lame duck Biden administration officials signed collective bargaining agreements with federal employee union bosses, specifically designed to tie the hands of the incoming President Trump, according to Comer's narrative. But what he's really describing is workers using their legal rights to protect themselves from an incoming administration that has openly declared war on the entire concept of civil service protections. And here's where it gets absolutely wild, where the authoritarian impulse becomes so transparent that you'd have to be willfully blind not to see it, because SA and the American Federation of Government Employees first reached the deal after Election Day, and under the agreement most agency employees will continue to be allowed to telework between 2 and 5 days per week, depending on their occupation, which means we're talking about memorializing existing workplace arrangements, not creating new extravagant benefits. Yet Comer is out here acting like Martin O'Malley, the Social Security Commissioner, committed some kind of bureaucratic terrorism by signing an agreement with union bosses just before he stepped down to run for Democratic National Committee chair that would lock in telework for tens of thousands of workers. Think about the framing here. Think about the language being deployed. Because when Comer uses the phrase Trumpproof the workforce, what he's really saying is that workers shouldn't have the legal right to negotiate protections against an administration that has made its hostility to the federal workforce abundantly clear. And this is after Trump's order blocked collective bargaining with unions at an array of federal agencies, including parts of the Departments of Defense, State, Veterans Affairs, Justice and Energy, which tells you everything you need to know about what Trump 2.0 actually means for workers. Now let's pause here because what Comer is deliberately obscuring requires us to understand the actual material reality of what's happening in this political moment, and I need you to understand that the House voted 231 to 195 on Thursday to pass legislation that would nullify President Trump's efforts to strip more than 1 million federal workers of their collective bargaining rights, with the measure introduced by Reps. Jared Golden and Brian Fitzpatrick effectively nullifying Trump's March executive order barring unions at more than 40 federal agencies under the guise of national security, which means that even some Republicans recognize that what Trump is doing constitutes what labor leaders are calling the single largest act of union busting in American history. And you want to talk about sabotage, you want to talk about subverting democracy, let's talk about how Donald Trump's executive order launched the biggest act of union busting in our history, ripping away collective bargaining rights from 1 million federal workers, and in the months since his administration has expanded that order and unilaterally canceled union contracts for more than 400,000 workers, because that's the actual constitutional crisis here, that's the actual assault on democratic norms. But here's what makes this whole spectacle even more insidious, even more calculated in its cruelty, because what Republicans like Comer are doing is tapping into this deep cultural resentment about telework and remote work arrangements that got baked into our discourse during the pandemic, weaponizing people's legitimate frustrations about government efficiency and turning them against workers who are just trying to maintain basic workplace protections in an era when President-elect Donald Trump has vowed to see federal workers return to the office, and his new Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, has pledged to trim costs by nixing telework. And we need to talk about DOGE. We need to talk about this absolutely dystopian experiment in plutocratic governance, because the number of federal employees who left their jobs in 2025 will total about 317,000 according to the Office of Personnel Management, after efforts by Elon Musk and the Trump administration to reshape the government workforce. And you want to tell me that unions trying to protect their members from this kind of arbitrary decimation represents sabotage? The sheer audacity of Republicans invoking FDR in this context, the sheer historical illiteracy of commerce saying none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a major champion of private sector unions, believed that public sector unions made no sense. House of Fact should tell you everything about how desperate they are to find any intellectual cover for what is fundamentally an ideological project to dismantle the administrative state. And yes, FDR did express concerns about public sector collective bargaining in 1937, but you know what context that statement came from. It came from an era when there were essentially no legal protections for public employees whatsoever, when the entire framework of labor relations was radically different, and using that quote now to justify stripping collective bargaining rights from over 1 million workers is the kind of historical cherry-picking that would get you laughed out of any serious academic setting. What we're really witnessing here is the collision of two fundamentally incompatible visions of how government should work in a democracy, and I need you to understand that when Comer talks about federal workers being weaponized to sabotage Trump, what he's actually describing is the existence of an independent civil service that doesn't serve at the pleasure of the president, that can't be fired on a whim, that has legal protections specifically designed to insulate it from political interference, because any power they have is delegated by the president, and they must be accountable to the president, who is the only member of the executive branch other than the vice president elected, and directly accountable to the American people. Yet in recent years there have been numerous and well-documented cases of career federal employees resisting and undermining the policies and directives of their executive leadership, according to Trump's own executive order, which is just a fancy way of saying that Trump believes he should have absolute authority over every single federal employee regardless of their civil service protections. And this brings us to Schedule F. This brings us to what Trump is actually trying to accomplish here, because OPM estimates 50,000 positions, or about 2% of federal workers, will be reclassified under the new rule, which renames Schedule F as Schedule Policy/Career, and would apply to career employees with important policy determining, policy making, policy advocating, or confidential duties, which sounds technical and bureaucratic until you realize that this is the mechanism by which Trump intends to convert tens of thousands of career civil servants into at-will employees who can be fired for any reason or no reason at all. The entire Project 2025 agenda, which Trump's allies have been quite explicit about, revolves around the ability to replace career professionals with political loyalists, and when unions try to protect their members from this purge, Republicans have the absolute gall to call it sabotage. Now let's talk about what's actually happening with productivity and service delivery at the Social Security Administration, because this is where the Republican narrative completely falls apart when confronted with actual empirical reality, and I need you to pay attention to this because AFG's SSA General Committee issued a statement defending the deal to preserve telework, which runs until October 2029, noting that the agency has seen a 6.2% overall gain in productivity this year, operating at current telework levels, which means that the telework arrangements Republicans are demonizing have actually made the agency more efficient, not less. And former Commissioner O'Malley himself defended his approach by saying, "It's hard to look at our productivity gains and service improvements and conclude that somehow we're all lazy, and the biggest drag on our service isn't the telework/on-site balance, but reducing staffing to a 50-year low." Which points to the real problem here, which is that Republicans have been systematically underfunding federal agencies for decades, and then pointing to the resulting service degradation as evidence that government doesn't work. This is the authoritarian playbook being executed in real time. This is what democratic backsliding looks like in a 21st century context, because what Trump and his allies are trying to do is fundamentally restructure the relationship between the presidency and the federal workforce in a way that concentrates unprecedented power in the executive. And when career employees and their unions try to maintain basic protections, Republicans frame it as some kind of insurrection. And the legal theory undergirding all of this is absolutely chilling, because OPM officials told agency HR leaders Tuesday that President Trump has Article 2 constitutional authority to remove tens of thousands of career federal workers in jobs over potential resistance to policy, which is basically claiming that the president has inherent constitutional power to fire anyone who disagrees with him. Let me be absolutely clear about what the stakes are here, because when you strip away all the rhetoric about efficiency and accountability and draining the swamp, what Republicans are proposing is nothing less than the destruction of the merit-based civil service system that has been a cornerstone of American governance since the Pendleton Act of 1883, which was passed specifically to end the spoils system, where every change in administration meant wholesale turnover of the federal workforce, and that system wasn't created by bleeding-heart liberals. It was created in response to rampant corruption and incompetence that came from treating government jobs as political patronage. Yet here we are in 2024 watching Republicans try to resurrect that same corrupt model under the guise of presidential accountability. And can we talk about the sheer hypocrisy of Republicans suddenly discovering their deep concern for taxpayers and government efficiency when 3 million work hours amounts to 0.69% of the 4.4 billion work hours performed by federal civilian employees each year, while the cost associated with that official time usage totals 2024's $6.8 trillion in federal discretionary spending, which means that the union activities that Comer is demonizing represent a rounding error in the federal budget. But you know what isn't a rounding error? The massive tax cuts for the wealthy that Republicans passed, the corporate subsidies they defend, the defense spending that never gets questioned, yet somehow federal workers having a few days of telework per week represents this existential threat to fiscal responsibility. What's happening right now is part of a much broader assault on labor rights that Republicans are executing at both the federal and state levels, and you need to understand this in its full context because 3 GOP trifecta states, Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee, enacted legislation directly aimed at undermining the UAW and workers' ability to organize unions, with new laws modeled on a bill from ALEC dictating that any corporation wanting to receive economic incentive funds from the state must agree not to respect the results of a card check and must waive their federal labor law right to recognize a union based on cards signed by its workers. So while Josh Hawley walks UAW picket lines and J.D. Vance cosplays as a friend of labor, Republican-controlled state legislatures are passing laws specifically designed to make union organizing harder, and this is the same party that's now clutching its pearls about federal unions protecting their members. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain the Republican position here is absolutely staggering, because on one hand they're telling us that federal workers are lazy and unproductive and need to be brought back to the office, but on the other hand they're admitting that hundreds of federal employees who lost their jobs in Elon Musk's cost-cutting blitz are being asked to return to work, and those who accept must report for duty after what amounts to a 7-month paid vacation, during which time the GSA in some cases racked up high costs passed along to taxpayers, which suggests that maybe, just maybe, those workers were actually necessary, and firing them was a catastrophic mistake, and this pattern has repeated across multiple agencies, with the IRS allowing some employees who took a resignation offer to remain on the job, while the Labor Department has also brought back some employees who took buyouts, and the National Park Service earlier reinstated a number of purged employees. Which tells you everything you need to know about the competence and planning behind DOG's efficiency crusade. Because let's be honest about what DOGE actually represents. It's an unaccountable shadow organization led by the richest man in the world, who has massive conflicts of interest given that his companies are heavily regulated by the very agencies he's dismantling. Within weeks, Musk's DOGE team had positioned people across the federal government, disrupting functions, gaining access to sensitive data, and executing cuts, with the activities sparking a growing number of legal challenges, questioning the legality of DOGE's sweeping access to confidential data, and the dismantling of agencies. This isn't government efficiency, this is oligarchic capture of the administrative state, and when unions try to protect their members from this kind of arbitrary and capricious treatment, Republicans accuse them of sabotaging democracy. What Comer is really upset about, what animates this entire line of attack, is that federal employee unions had the temerity to use their legal rights to negotiate contracts that would constrain Trump's ability to unilaterally reshape the federal workforce in his own image, and the fact that these negotiations happened after the election, the fact that they were finalized during the transition period, is presented as some kind of smoking gun evidence of bad faith. But you know what's actually bad faith? Pretending that incoming administrations don't routinely face constraints from previous administrations, pretending that there's something uniquely illegitimate about workers protecting themselves from an administration that has been explicit about its intention to gut the civil service. The Trump-proofing language that Comer keeps using is particularly revealing because it implicitly accepts that Trump's agenda includes things that workers need to be protected from, that there are policies and actions that the incoming administration plan to take that unions correctly identified as threatening to their members' interests. And rather than defending those policies on the merits, rather than making the case that Trump's vision for the federal workforce would actually improve government functioning, Republicans have decided to simply delegitimize the very existence of federal employee unions and the collective bargaining process itself. This is textbook authoritarian rhetoric, where any institutional check on executive power gets reframed as illegitimate obstruction, where career professionals with expertise and independence get cast as a shadowy deep state conspiracy, where workers organizing to protect their interests becomes weaponization of the bureaucracy. And what makes it even more insidious is that it's wrapped in this populist language about giving power back to the people and draining the swamp, when what it actually represents is concentrating power in the hands of a president who believes he should be able to fire anyone who disagrees with him. Let's talk about what actually constitutes sabotage here, because of May 30, 2025. According to one researcher's estimate, DOGE cuts to foreign aid programs had led to some 300,000 deaths, mostly of children, and as of December 4, 2025, the estimated number of deaths exceeds 661,000, which represents the actual human cost of the efficiency crusade that Comer is defending. That's what happens when you let billionaires with no government experience and no accountability make wholesale cuts to programs they don't understand. That's the real sabotage, the real undermining of government's ability to serve the public interest. But sure, let's focus on whether Social Security workers get to telework 2 days a week. That's clearly the urgent crisis facing the nation. The entire framing of this controversy reveals how thoroughly the Republican Party has internalized this fantasy that the federal workforce is full of partisan Democrats just waiting to sabotage conservative governance. And there's this deep paranoia animating all of this, where any resistance to Trump's agenda, any questioning of his policies, any use of normal institutional processes to push back against executive overreach gets interpreted as evidence of a conspiracy. And this paranoia has been weaponized to justify what is fundamentally an attack on the independence and professionalism of the civil service, because if you can convince people that federal workers are all secret partisans, then you can justify gutting their protections and replacing them with political loyalists. What's so maddening about watching this clip is the way Comer presents himself as the defender of democracy, as the champion of what the American people voted for, when what he's actually defending is a vision of executive power that would have horrified the founders, and that represents a fundamental departure from how American government has operated for over a century. Because the whole point of having a professional civil service with job protections is to create some insulation from politics, to ensure that there's institutional knowledge and expertise that survives across administrations, to prevent the kind of wholesale partisan purges that Comer is now trying to enable. And let's be real about what's driving this, because it's not actually about efficiency or accountability or serving taxpayers, it's about power. It's about control. It's about ensuring that the next time Republicans control the executive branch, they can implement their agenda without having to deal with career professionals who might point out that their policies are illegal, or impractical, or destructive. It's about creating a federal workforce that's loyal to Trump personally, rather than to the Constitution, or to the public interest, and that's why unions are such a threat, because organized workers with legal protections are much harder to intimidate, and much harder to replace with yes-men. The fact that 20 Republicans joined all present Democrats to pass a bill 231-195, demonstrating their support for the nonpartisan civil service through a discharge petition that unions had been rallying for, arguing the erosion of federal workers' job protections and rights represented an existential threat to the broader American labor movement, tells you that even some Republicans recognize that what Trump is doing crosses a line, that there are limits to how far you can go in undermining basic labor rights, even in service of partisan objectives. But Comer isn't one of those Republicans. Comer is all in on the authoritarian project, fully committed to this vision where presidential power is essentially unlimited, and anyone who gets in the way is an enemy of the people. What we're watching is the Republican Party's long-standing hostility to unions merging with Trumpism's authoritarian impulses to create this toxic combination where workers exercising their legal rights becomes evidence of a conspiracy against democracy itself. And the language matters here. The way Comer talks about union bosses rather than elected union leadership, the way he frames collective bargaining as weaponization rather than normal labor relations, the way he presents workplace protections as obstacles to accountability rather than basic rights. All of this is designed to delegitimize the very existence of federal employee unions and to prepare the ground for their destruction, because that's what this is ultimately about. It's about breaking the last major bastion of union strength in the United States. It's about ensuring that the federal government can become a laboratory for the kind of at-will employment regime that corporations have imposed in the private sector. It's about creating a workforce that lives in fear and that can be fired at any time for any reason, and if they can do it to federal workers, if they can strip collective bargaining rights from over 1 million people under the guise of national security and efficiency, what's to stop them from going after unions in other sectors? What's to prevent the complete dismantling of what remains of the American labor movement? The stakes here extend far beyond federal employment policy, far beyond questions about telework or performance management, because what's really being contested is whether workers in America will have any power to collectively bargain over the conditions of their employment, or whether we're going to complete the transition to a fully neoliberalized economy where capital has absolute power and labor has none. And that's why unions have been so adamant about fighting back. That's why labor leaders are calling this the biggest attack on workers in American history, because they understand that if Trump and his allies succeed in destroying federal employee unions, it will have cascading effects throughout the entire economy. What makes Comer's performance here so particularly galling is the faux populism of it all, the pretense that he's fighting for regular Americans against some entrenched elite, when in reality he's carrying water for a billionaire-funded assault on working people. Because who actually benefits from breaking federal employee unions, who profits from creating an at-will federal workforce? It's not ordinary taxpayers, it's not the people who depend on government services, it's the wealthy donors who want less regulation of their businesses, it's the corporate interests who see an independent civil service as an obstacle to their agenda. And we need to connect this to the broader project of the Republican Party, because this isn't happening in isolation. This is part of a coordinated effort to reshape American government in ways that benefit the wealthy and powerful, at the expense of everyone else. From the tax cuts that disproportionately benefit the rich, to the deregulation that allows corporations to pollute and exploit workers, to the attacks on the social safety net, to the gutting of agencies that enforce labor and environmental and consumer protection laws, it's all part of the same project, and destroying federal employee unions is a crucial piece of that puzzle. What Comer is describing in this clip, what he's presenting as evidence of sabotage and conspiracy, is actually just workers using their legal rights to protect themselves from an incoming administration with a demonstrated hostility to their interests. And the fact that he finds this threatening, the fact that he thinks it's illegitimate for unions to negotiate contracts during a transition period, tells you everything about how Republicans view labor rights, which is to say they don't think workers should have any. In their ideal world, Trump would have been able to come into office and immediately fire tens of thousands of federal employees and replace them with political loyalists, and the only thing standing in the way of that authoritarian fantasy were those collective bargaining agreements that Comer is now demonizing. This is why the fight over federal employee unions matters so much, why we need to be absolutely clear about what's at stake and who's on what side, because if Republicans succeed in stripping collective bargaining rights from federal workers, it will embolden anti-union forces across the country, and it will mark a significant step backward in the struggle for economic justice and worker power. And conversely, if unions and their allies can beat back this assault, if they can preserve collective bargaining rights and civil service protections in the face of this unprecedented attack, it will demonstrate that organized labor still has the power to resist, and that there are limits to how far the authoritarian project can advance. So no, Comer, federal unions exercising their legal rights to negotiate contracts that protect their members is not sabotage, it's not weaponization, it's not an attack on democracy. What's an attack on democracy is trying to strip collective bargaining rights from over 1 million workers. What's sabotage is attempting to replace a professional merit-based civil service with a system of political patronage. What's an assault on American values is concentrating unprecedented power in the hands of a president who has shown nothing but contempt for institutional constraints and the rule of law. The real story here isn't that unions tried to Trump-proof the federal workforce. It's that Trump and his Republican allies are trying to destroy the last remnants of worker power in America, and they're using every propaganda technique at their disposal to convince people that resistance to authoritarianism is somehow the real threat to democracy. And we cannot, we must not, we will not let that narrative stand unchallenged.